Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I shall see the people right at the back. Adrian Maloney, where are you? Yeah, mate, zip it. Well, that was a great warm-up act by Phil Rickards this morning, the smoothest man from South Wales and the smoothest man in the buy-to-let industry. But he gave us some really great insights, and he touched on the topic I'm now going to talk about, which is the green mortgage environment and how it impacts us, principally in buy-to-let, but I will also be referring to the market more generally. And clearly you will come away thinking, is this some form of latter-day, bald-headed, white-haired eco-warrior, a grumpy old bastard, or a government basher? But probably a combination of all three. So please accept my apologies in advance if I get carried away and drop the odd expletive in. And for the Mortgage Solutions teams, certainly none of the language should be repeated in any articles you might choose to write. So for this to be CPD qualifying, I'm told we have to have a few expressions up here. Right, move on very quickly. Let's get into the meat of it. We cannot be sitting here in quarter 2, 2022, having a conversation about climate change denial. That left-hand picture could be Australia, it could be California, or it could be the North York Moors. Let's have an acceptance that the climate is changing, even in Frau Merkel's fair land of Germany. Oh no, she's not Chancellor now. It's our extraordinary little, nasty little man called Schultz, who thinks it's okay to send billions of euros every day to Vlad the Impaler and not turn down his central heating. But ladies and gentlemen, it's happening. Climate change denial is no longer on the agenda. It's about what is actually happening. So, of course, we had the Conference of the Parties in November 2026. We were supposedly hosting it jointly with the Italians. I didn't hear any Italian language in the room, but it was hosted by Alex Sharma, who I think did a good job in very testing circumstances, but actually the conference failed. Its objective was to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C. They didn't achieve it. The one thing they did win was deforestation, that the countries that control 85% of the world's forests have signed up to deforestation stopping by 2030. But their biggest failure was in the last 36 hours, they couldn't get the coal-consuming countries on power stations to agree to finish coal-fired stations. So India and China were the principal culprits. You weren't going to get anything out of the Russians anyway. And that went on to literally the back burner. And that is probably what's now going to contribute most significantly to global warming in the next 10 or 15 years. In fact, the Germans have gone even as far to keep on closing down their nuclear-fueled power stations, and they're reactivating coal-powered power stations as well, using the excuse of Vlad the Impaler to get themselves off the ecology hook. So it wasn't a great success, but things are still happening. And if you look at this country, these are the provisional figures for 2020, and it would appear, if you look at that top left-hand corner, that housing is a culprit because it's gone from 15% to 21% of our emissions. But at the same time, emissions were coming down. And if you think in 2020, where were we all in March and April? We were all at home. So clearly housing emissions were going to go up over that period relative to the rest of the data. But whichever way you look at it, housing accounts for somewhere between 15 and 20% of our greenhouse gas emissions as a country, and therefore it's relevant that we as an industry talk about it, come up with solutions, get on the journey, and start showing some changes. I'm always amused that we use a tractor logo for farms. Actually, it's not the tractors on the farms that create the 10% emissions, it's the cattle and the pigs and the sheep and the other things that cause all the damage. But let's take credit. You know, we dropped 2.8% 2018 to 2019. We dropped 9.5% in 2020. Probably that's a distorted reflection of lockdown. It's probably about 4 or 5%. But only when you get to the results for 2021, we'll be able to work out what the true run rate is. And we'll talk more about how it's coming down in a minute or two. So, a timeline, and there is an error. There should always be at least one error on a presentation. That should say October 2022, but we'll come to that in a moment. But clearly, we've already been on the journey with our landlord clients because EPCs were imposed as a minimum of E back in 2018, and for existing tenants, 2020. So we started to drag the landlord housing stock out of the mire several years before the main housing market. And bizarrely, those of us who are working in the market, and it's only a few years ago now, 2018, 2020, That wasn't as painful as we all thought it was going to be. A bit of a nervous time, and how did landlords get through it? But by and large, there might be a few outliers still in lenders' back books that haven't yet been flushed out, but all new lending since that period has been on properties that generally were deemed to be more acceptable quality. But here we are. Here's the big problem, isn't it? The electricity cap that was at 17p late last year has now unwelcomely gone to 28p, and the expectation is that by October of this year, not October of that year, in fact that one's wrong as well, it goes to 40p. So you're seeing electricity all of a sudden being a bigger driver of change because it's economic necessity. And we'll come back to that again in a minute. And this is the current roadmap, April 2025, that Johnson announced on the 19th of November 2020. But it's still going through the House of Commons. It's been to the House of Lords once, it's come back. It's got its second reading, which was deferred from March, next week. And Doug Hall, who's hosting the Q&A session later on, he's a thorough man for research, is Mr. Hall. He's actually got the bill in his pocket. When that shows a degree of attention to detail that I could never get to. And he's rightly pointed out to me earlier on that the draft bill has not April 2025 on it, 31st of December 2025. So it's already slipped 8 months. And I think by the time it's finished and it's come under pressure from the Tory backbenchers, it will move out to April 2026, if not further beyond, because do you know what? There's all sorts of economic headwinds going on, and we've been in a lockdown, and there's all sorts of things that we haven't been able to do. So this is still what is written, and you've got a 3-year cushion for existing tenancies, but you could well see that moving out. So there is still a cliff edge, but I think that cliff edge will move out beyond the date that Doug is able to prove to you later, and I'm sure he'll be able to quote you paragraph 1, subpara A, subpara 2 as the right date. Thank you, Mr. Hall. So the perspective of the housing industry, that we go back to Boris Johnson in November 2020, he wanted us to be putting in 600,000 pumps a year by 2028. Well, we all know the pumps really aren't good enough at the moment. They're too darned expensive, they're not efficient enough, and they don't get the heating into the house to the right level. But, interestingly enough, Octopus Energy last week bought the biggest UK pump manufacturer, which is based in Northern Ireland, for an undisclosed sum, so you can see that people are going to be investing in the technology and it's going to start to arrive soon. The government does have a pump grant scheme, generous, 90,000 pumps over 3 years. That's 30,000 pumps a year over the next 3 years, to a maximum contribution of £5,000 for an ordinary pump or £6,000 for a ground heat source pump. The average cost for an average dwelling for an ordinary pump is between £7,500 to £12,000, and a ground source heat system will cost you somewhere between £12,000 and £20,000. So it's not exactly breaking the back of the cost of the whole exercise, and it's not a really good offering, especially when down here, the Green Homes Grant Scheme lasted less than 9 months, and once the government realised that people like you and I had worked out how to access it, they spent all the money and they pulled it down at 72 hours notice. And we were promised a replacement this month. Radio silence, no replacement. Let me just pick up on this a bit. Phil Richards, many of you will know, who's the sales director at Keystone, he built himself a new house in 2015. Someone must be paying him too much money, and he got a quote at that time for putting solar panels on. But the planning authority said, no, we don't going to allow you to do that, so he didn't put it on. But it would have cost him £22,000 back in 2015. He got it repriced last week. Half the cost. In fact, it's less than half the cost, because on top of that, you need to add VAT at 5%. Now, there's no VAT on that at all. Go back to my earlier reference about the cost of electricity going up. You would do a cost-benefit analysis, because you're all bright people at home, and say, it would have cost me 12 to 13 years to get that money back. Look at the price of the electricity going forward. The buyback period is now less than 5 or 6 years. So some of these things are playing out through economic changes that make these changes that we all need to do to our houses more logical. But the thieves in the room are the electricity companies, because they're not obliged to offer you a high price for your spare electricity you put back into the national grid. The current average payment across all electricity companies is 5.24 pence per unit of electricity. Go back to that earlier chart. It's now 28 pence is what you're paying, and it'll go up to 40 pence, but they're not obliged by government to offer you a fixed percentage, whether it's 50%, 60 or 70%. So there's got to be a change in the rules. You can't be buying electricity off them on a day when there's no sunshine at 40 pence a unit, and on a sunny day when you're giving them electricity back, all you get is 5.25 pence. There's something immoral about that, and that's corporate greed, and the government need to get on the bus. Voluntary target for lenders to reach an average portfolio of EPC by 2030. What are lenders going to do? Criminalise those that can't get to the right number? Are we going to create another class of mortgage prisoners? We still haven't sorted out the problem from the early 2000s, and we're going to create a vastly larger group on it. So we've got to see what the legislation comes up with. Moving on, because I will get into trouble with Una shortly. I'm just going to move straight off this and go to the next one. But this is something to look at when you look at the links when you get back home. What are the costs of getting this all up to grade C? So this is all housing stock across the UK, but not including council stock. Because, of course, council stock is worse than what your clients have. But, of course, they're going to be 100% funded by the government, aren't they? So this all totals up to a magnificent 48.3 billion, call it 50 billion. But here's the interesting thing, ladies and gentlemen. From this period here, properties in the D band that were coming out an average of 62 have been moving up gently through the years at an average of 1/4 point a year. You know, at some point, we're going to get away from A to E. A to E is what came in when HIPs were invented and then promptly died 12 or 15 years ago and was a very blunt instrument. You know, it's going to be important in a future world that you understand whether your client has a property down here at 61 points, or actually is their property up here at 67 points and is only 2 points getting into the C band? Is the cost of them moving up from there to there 2.5 grand, or is it 9.5 grand from down here? So why are we talking about these large bands? I think you'll see within 18 months, lenders and you as brokers and your clients will be focusing, where am I? Am I in a D? Am I just in an E? What's it going to cost me to get up to the right level? But in order to get that net zero figure, this run rate needs to move from 1/4 point per year up to 1/2 point a year. And that's going to take government incentives. You can't rely on people doubling their investment in property just because the government thinks it's a wizardly good plan. So there's got to be more coming into all of this. And we already have that technology in our systems where we can report back to you, and we can even give you an estimate based on some software a company called Logic runs that says, broadly, if you're in a house in Leicester and you're taking it from a C grade at 64 to a D grade at 64 to a C grade at 70, it might cost £7,400. Clearly, in London, it would cost more because of labour costs and transport costs. It might cost £8,800. These are only estimates, but it helps get people on the journey, and that's the sort of information and educational technology we should be able to put in your laps. So, lenders are going to have to produce much more accurate and customizable analysis of their loan books. It's important to lenders like me that use the capital markets. Hopefully one day when I go to the capital markets, I will get recognition that we're doing 13% of our mortgages at C or above that are green, and I'll get a lower price. At the moment, they say, thank you very much, David, and they pocket the differential margin, but they'll come under pressure from government to offer more sustainable finance at the wholesale level, which then drops through our locker, then drops down to borrowers. But at the moment, we have to do it out of goodwill, and I'm not asking for any sympathy on that. That's where the market is at the moment. And of course, we'll have to make sure we don't end up with customers stuck in the rut. Yeah, there will not be a cliff edge on this. What is the government seriously going to do if it was April 2025? Are they seriously going to say to us as lenders, you must now check all your landlord properties, and if they've got a property that's now D or E and they put a new tenant into it, are you going to tell them they're going to have to throw that tenant out? How many thousands of tenants will end up at the local council doors going, knock, knock, I've been thrown out by government statutory legislation, my landlord hasn't got the property to the right standard, I'm on the street, what are you going to do about it? Talk about a housing crisis in the making. So that rules or law that coming out of the government is going to be so interesting to see what they're going to do to understand that they're creating a potential cliff edge. We're going to have to solve it, but at the moment the cliff edge is entirely of the government's making. And of course, we've all got to have open access to green finance products, and we'll look back at the products that are currently out there. I will look at some in a moment. You know, they're okay, but we'll look back in 5 years' time and say they look much better, they're much more fit for purpose. I put this up just to remind us all in the room, we're all home occupiers and homeowners probably as well. This is how the average breakdown of what is spent on a house on energy use. 47% on the central heating itself. So 2 of my kids were over the Easter weekend. It was a nice sunny day. In the evening, the temperature went down, and my son went straight to the thermostat on the wall. His arm is now in a sling with a broken wrist, and I told him to go and put a fucking pullover on. But ladies and gentlemen, we've got to start having these conversations seriously with ourselves. I've got members of my team back in the office who think it's a birthright to walk around their houses in shorts and T-shirts on the 1st of January and still complain it's cold. Jack up the heating. Let's start having the conversations with ourselves first. But there's the most extraordinary one, ladies and gentlemen. Washing and drying. 13% of your electricity or gas bills go on that. Well, only about 2% is the washing machine. The other 11% is the tumble dryer. Have you ever heard of hanging up the washing and leaving it to dry naturally for 24 hours? But with electricity going to 40 pence a unit, I'm damn well sure you will do shortly. Moving on very swiftly. So, it's not going to be April 2025. Doug already knows it's the 31st of December. I think it will move out into 2026. But these costs, you know, it's going to be somewhere around about 8 to 10,000 to get from D to C, add on another 8,000 to get from E through D to C, and it's going to be a little bit of, excuse my French, a little bit of a shit show. We've got 54% of our book sitting in that category. And a lady upstairs asked me earlier, but I'm going to sell my client a 5-year fixed rate next week. They're going to be in trouble in 3 years' time, according to that. I said, well, they're not going to be because the government can't force a cliff edge. But we haven't seen the detail yet, which is another reason why it's all going to get pushed out. The really bright ones of you in the room, so that doesn't include Adrian, will add up 54% and 45% and say, well, that doesn't come to 100%, which again, you've lost 1% of your book. Well, we do have 1% of our book, bizarrely, that have already got exemptions because they've got grade 2 listed properties or some such. And you will be able to get exemptions from this, but it won't be a straight pass-through. The debate for landlords is if they've got a property that's C and it's better, do they charge more rent because their tenant isn't going to pay less on the electricity bill? That's the ongoing tension relationship between a landlord and his or her tenant. So let's just look back a year ago. First off the rocks, Foundation Home Loans. Well done, Hans & Co., great product, A and B, remortgages only, but they made a start. We followed 3 weeks later. Paragon had an excellent further advanced product, but then the government withdrew the Green Homes Grant Scheme. So that collapsed in 24 hours, but they were out there doing something. And here we are, having moved from 7 lenders with sort of just under 100 products now to 13 lenders with 150 products. So you've got to probably say there's a solution for most of your landlord clients out there who've got a green property. But the real problem is, can you actually identify it on a sourcing system? And I'll mention that briefly in a moment. We're out there, we've been running it for just over a year. It now counts for 13% of the applications we get in. And we don't offer the green product on new build. It's a point of principle to me. This is on people who've got a property that they've either bought done up or they've done it up and they're coming to us because they've got it to grade C. We've got one landlord client, in fact, his broker was in the room upstairs and she spoke to me afterwards. He buys back-to-back terrace houses in Liverpool. He does them up into HMOs, extends them out to the back. He used to do them at a very acceptable grade, EPC grade D. In fact, Kent Reliance have got some on their books as well because I look at the property portfolios unlike some. He now does them to grade C. So he said, what's the extra cost? He said, well, as I'm gushing the properties anyway, the actual cost to get it up an extra grade is £2,300. All right, you could say, well, that's easy because he's in the middle of a refurbishment. But there are people already on this journey. It's like people buying EVs. I wouldn't buy an EVs more than fly to the moon because where would I get the damn thing recharged and the battery pack doesn't last. But there are more people buying EVs than the government thought. So you'd be surprised the number of your clients who are already on this journey. And because we're nice people, we plant a tree for every green mortgage that we do. Sourcing systems. 27 Tech, you can input for green. You can get green data out of a knowledge bank, Smarter Criteria and Criteria Hub. Iris and Mortgage Brain, they're not there yet. And I've suggested to both those sourcing systems, by all means go on the color coding A to E, but at some point you've got to put the number score in. They've gone, why? So they're back solving for yesterday's problem, not forward solving for next year's challenge. But they'll only do it if you guys, because you pay them subs, you tell them what you want, and they respond. You know, this market operates, buy-to-let market in particular, on brokers. You are the key influencers, and when you guys, as a united group, say what you want, lenders pay attention, as do sourcing systems. So just to finalize and just to take any questions if I haven't upset Una on the time clock yet. So we account for 21% of greenhouse gas emissions in the housing sector, and clearly landlords are a different part of that, as Phil Rickards mentioned earlier on. So not engaging with it is not clearly an option. We will have to get to SAP figures rather than color codes, and we are building momentum, but it's not yet always visible at the right point. But government has backed off. Green Homes Grant has gone, they've not replaced it. You've got planning challenges. where some planning authorities say, well, we don't fancy having solar panels on roofs, but people are entitled to put them on their roofs because the government are issuing grants for it and 0% VAT. So there's a whole series of mismatched parts on all of this. But most of you will know that I'm formerly a broker. So the broker influence on this is massive. Speak to your clients, say to them, this is not a cliff edge, but we need to start working on it. Is it right after your 5-year fix now, when you could be in trouble at the end of it? Or do you have a plan in hand for that? How are you going to put some money to one side and do the work at some point? And you need to keep reminding us as lenders and the sourcing systems what it is that you want and what you think your clients need to navigate their way through the next few years. And of course, for yourselves, think about it for your own business. We offset all of our electricity because we live in an air-conditioned office, which is fine, but there isn't a single window we can open, so we offset. We plant trees. We always got a green product range, and in amongst our team, we have a green product ambassadors, and they get a budget from the managing director, and they spend it on things that they think are good for the company. Think about that even in your own businesses. Every little bit that we all do does make a big difference.